Hello, this is Lee Allen back with the episode 2 of the Democracy If You Can Keep It podcast. I'm joined once again by my fellow co hosts, Mr. Michael Dennis, our resident conservative, and Mr. Thomas Hayward, our fellow resident left winger. In this episode,
Hello.
we will discuss three very important issues affecting the world today: the Canadian election, which is taking place as we speak, time of recording. Then it will be the passing of Pope Francis and his legacy and the potential successors that could take over. And we shall conclude it with the first part of Battle of the Ballots, in which I shall discuss the Australian election. But Thomas, if you would first like to take it away with the Canadian election.
Yes, thank you very much, Lee. So currently, as Lee said at the time of recording, Canadians are off to the polls to vote in what could be one of the most important Canadian elections in recent memory. We have the Liberal Party, who is campaigning on a Canada First agenda, where they are seeking to reinforce Canada's economic situation, especially with the increasing tensions between America and Canada, and to build stronger relations with Europe, especially in regards to subjects such as the Ukraine war. We're seeing the Conservatives using the attack line that the Liberal government has not changed. Even with a change of leadership, they still reflect the old ideas of Trudeau, which they say have led Canadians into economic ruin. And most importantly, we have seen what could be said to be the largest Canadian polling turn in history, where we had Canadians turning away from the Conservatives, who were originally the favourites to win, to the Liberal Party in February and January. Polling was suddenly flipped from the Liberals trailing behind the Conservatives to suddenly taking as high as a 20-point lead in some polls over the Conservatives, shattering records of past polling heights not seen since the early days of Trudeau's first time in office. And it does reflect a crisis moment for the Conservatives as they attempt to readjust their rhetoric after, in fact, aligning themselves originally with some of Trump's tariff policies. They now attempt to find a way to turn themselves into a party that is different from its Republican neighbors. How will they do this? Well, we'll find out what the voters think of their efforts by the point of tomorrow.
It is rather interesting because a lot of people seem to believe populism is the current popular thing right now, ironically enough. But in this election, you have Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, very much the sort of classic conservative populist. And Mark Carney, the Liberal leader and Prime Minister currently, is the ultimate insider, former head of the Bank of Canada, former head of the Bank of England, very sort of career civil servant almost. And it seems as though we've seen the downfall of populism almost because people have switched towards this insider and his new breadth of ideas that he's brought to the Canadian political system.
Yes, I do really agree with that. And I would say, actually, even though I am a conservative at heart, I do really like Mark Carney.
Hmm.
I think if he, as expected, if he does get elected, I think he'll bring a wealth of experience to the table. And with obviously with Trump and how Trump today or a couple of days ago, I can't remember if it's today or a couple of days, he said something about Canada becoming the 51st state. I feel like
Hmm.
with Carney's sort of experience of Canada and his political, even though he's not a
Hmm.
political figure when he was in England as Bank of England, but with his sort of knowledge of the world, he should be a very good president if he gets elected.
Hmm. It also does seem as though the primary way the Liberals were able to catch up to the Conservatives was as we are seeing the slow death of the left wing NDP, previously polling at 20% before Carney came in. They are now polling at below 10. a vast majority of their voters have switched to Carney out of his new breath of fresh air, and also fear that there will be a Canadian government under the Conservatives, which will be sort of under the thumb of the Trump administration, it seems.
Yes, definitely.
Yes,
What we've also seen is
I guess.
Oh, yes,
Oh, I was just going to say that also another problem again, though, for Mark is the attempts to distance himself with the Trudeau administration because they, by the end of their sort of run, were quite an unpopular administration.
Hmm.
But in terms of the cabinet that Mark has appointed, it is largely reflective still of Trudeau's legacy. So, for a lot of Canadians, they still are looking for really strong signs that Mark is going to bring not just a different image to the Liberal Party, but also different policies to the
hmm,
Liberal Party, not just those that simply reflect Trudeau's own policies from the
hmm,
past.
Yeah.
quite true. The great hurdle, as always in this election, does seem to be the Bloc Québécois. And Quebec's separatism, although has dropped in recent years, the Bloc has been quite a hurdle for political parties, as Quebec's 78 seats is usually the key for every Liberal leader that wants to get in. But as the Bloc are doing relatively well, it seems, in polling, they could most likely form an issue for Carney if he's unable to win over enough Quebec voters, as he himself is not from Quebec, as Trudeau was, which gave him a great advantage within the province. In terms of other parties, the Greens, as always, are not doing particularly well, as they now seem to be just sort of the party of the cult around Elizabeth May, and the right wing People's Party, led by Maxime Bernier, seems to have fallen off since the rise of Polyev, as any right wing voter in the Conservative Party that might go to the People's Party now seems content with Polyev, his policies, and his very aggressive debating style in the House of Commons have made him very much a darling of the Canadian right of late.
Yeah, but what I would say is actually quite interesting how we've seen like looking at with the far right, well, not the far, but the right wing side of the Canadian political spectrum has sort of been replicated at the moment in the UK with like reform, because like reform, I would say are actually doing quite badly at the minute. Rupert Lowe today or yesterday came out and spoke against reform completely and has backed the Conservatives to be the party, or well, to be a proper party of good opposition going up to the next election. So, and I mean, if you look at the Green Party in the UK, let's be honest now, the Green Party, I don't think I've ever really ever A, met a Green Party member, and B, I don't think they have um, much of a membership really, except for maybe the young people. But like a lot of young people obviously don't care about politics. But
Mm.
yeah,
They, in terms of sort of comparing the two nations, the Green Party in the UK is much more successful than the Canadian one. The Green Party in the UK actually has a list of policies, whereas the Canadian Greens seem to be simply the cult of Elizabeth May, who's this very large, almost conspiratorial figure in Canada. For example, she gave a lot of credit to 9/11 truther theories in the Canadian Green Party. And so a lot of people who may want to go to the Green Party, as voters in the UK do to the British Greens, haven't, because they see it as sort of her cult party rather than a credible political party to the left of the NDP or the Liberals.
definitely, yeah.
I think so far what we're most likely going to see, it does seem as though the Liberals will squeak out a victory. However, you can't ever say never in politics.
No, definitely. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what the results are of the first election today.
because the Canadian Parliament have been without a governing majority since, I believe, 2019, was it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's 2019.
I think it'll be quite refreshing to a lot of voters to have a government that's got a majority rather than having to cooperate with different parties all the time on different issues.
Mm.
I think it'll be interesting to see what happens, and we'll have to see what goes on later tonight and how it goes in terms of voting. But I think with that, shall we move on to the recent passing of Pope Francis, Michael?
Yeah, I think we should, and I think it's obviously I think it's really important to say. Obviously, this happened a week ago now, but I still think it's really important, even a week later, that we still talk about his legacy, because it's definitely a legacy that is different to any other papal president, any other papal
Mm.
sort of pope we've had. Sorry, yeah, the amount like any different pope we've had, I mean, his legacy is like just completely unchangeable, and he's I can't think what the word is, but he's really changed how the Catholic Church has been set up.
Indeed, he was probably one of the most progressive popes we've ever had.
That's what I was thinking of. Yeah, progressive. So yeah, yeah, he definitely is. I mean, because he's done a lot. I mean, he's allowed a lot more people of to be elected to the conclave and as cardinals. And
Indeed.
obviously now they've set today, as of recording, they've set a date for the 7th of May for the new conclave to be formed to elect a new pope, and I feel like this could be a really good time to have either a female pope in or someone who is of a different ethnicity that we haven't seen before as a pope.
I don't think. I think for now, the Catholic Church are not quite at the stage where they will want a. Well, we can't have a female pope yet because there aren't any female cardinals, I don't believe, within the Catholic Church. That'll be a few years down the line, I imagine. But in terms of sort of potential diversity, there's definitely room for it. There's a long list of potentials to replace Pope Francis, many of whom come from different sections of the world.
Yeah, well, the thing that I was going to say actually was that the favourite to be the next pope is Pietro Parolin, who is the Vatican Secretary of State under Pope Francis. So he's like the second in command of being an advisor, and he was the deputy pope, so he could be a really good front runner. But the only issue is he is 70, and I know that most popes are quite old, but could it not be a good idea at this sort of time? It'd be quite good to have a younger pope like John Paul
Mm,
Pope II.
mm,
So yeah.
mm. There is a large push for Cardinal Louis Antonio Tagle, 67, probably the most liberal person running in this election, who's got a lot of. He's very much the sort of darling of the progressive Catholics, and probably their ideal choice to get in this election.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like they're gonna try and stick with someone who knows the job very well and has a sort of same beliefs as Pope Francis, because I feel
Mm,
like how he's set the way of the Catholic Church in his papacy has
mm.
completely shifted um, the rest of the world, and I feel like the Catholic Church now is probably one of the most diverse churches in the world.
We
100%.
must remember that it's an election as well, and they are unlikely to vote for someone that is against the principles that are the majority. And most of the cardinals reflect Pope Francis's views, former policies, and so they will be highly unlikely to vote for anyone who has any strong disagreements with that. So it will be almost entirely guaranteed that we will simply have a successor who is a continuation of the former Pope's views on progressive liberal policies towards
Mm.
all things regarding the Catholic Church.
Well,
Mm.
it's really important to remember that going into the conclave, Pope Francis appointed 80% of the cardinals who will vote in this conclave. So I feel like it will have to be some. It most definitely will be someone that has the same views or similar views, sorry, to the Pope.
Mm. Definitely. I think also I think as a Catholic, a lot of Catholics that I've spoken to don't particularly like the idea that there is politics that goes on behind the scenes. And there is. It's an election. There will be deals made of if you do this and I'll do this. And there is sort of a wider field for a progressive pope. The conservative candidates running have a lot of policies which I think there are a lot of the more conservative candidates are apprehensive about gay marriage for one, divorced couples being given communion. I think the worry of a lot of cardinals will be that if they get in a pope similar to Pope John Paul II in his very conservative ideas, they could scare a lot of more liberal Catholics out of the church and into the Protestant church, which a lot of people see as being more liberal by comparison.
Yeah, and it's all. I think it's really important to remember, like, even though they're starting on the 7th of May, we probably won't get a new pope now until like the 10th,
Hmm.
because conclaves never have lasted one day, and they never ever will, because it's such a complex process, and people don't always agree. I mean, the longest one I think was something like 2 years and 58 days or something.
Yeah, I think that was probably several hundred years ago, that one.
Yeah, I think it was because the last two, so for Pope Francis and also for Pope Benedict, they were both only 3 days long.
Okay.
So it really, really, really is just a waiting game now, and we
Hmm.
have to wait and see. And I really hope it is someone that does bring more change than obviously Pope Francis did a lot of change, but someone who can even bring even more change to
Hmm.
sort of
Hmm.
change the
I
church.
think definitely. In terms of Pope Francis's legacy, I think he'll probably be remembered as one of the not only the most progressive, but probably the most humble and down to earth pope that we'd seen, some believe, since Saint Peter was pope back 2 millennia ago.
Yes, I actually agree with that. And I would also say it's really, really important as a legacy to remember that when obviously war broke out in Ukraine, Pope Francis actually said that he didn't want to get the church involved or the Vatican involved. He would rather be there
Mm,
as a mediator.
mm, mm,
So I think it's really important to show like how his service to keeping peace in the world. And I
mm,
believe he's one of the most. I don't think he's the most because I think that was John Paul, but I think he's one of the most well-travelled popes we've had in a while.
mm. Indeed. I know his own personal, I believe I saw it. His personal possessions when he died were a Bible, an old pair of black shoes that he'd had for some time, and a £20 wristwatch showing just how humble he was
Yeah,
compared to a lot of popes.
he definitely had a lot of humility because he also the four I think it's like the £400,000 salary you can have as a pope. He decided
Mm,
to send that to charity every year.
indeed. Although he's not without his controversies, one of the big issues that parked up, especially when he was made a cardinal in Argentina, was an issue that when he was head of the Jesuit priesthood in Argentina in the dirty wars back in the mid 20th century,
Yeah,
there was a belief that Francis had allowed two Jesuit priests who were vocally against the dictatorship of Argentina at the time to be carted off and tortured, which caused a lot of anger among many people when he was made cardinal. But of course, it came out not too long after that in fact it wasn't Pope Francis, even though in fact he had actually gone to the dictatorship of the nation at the time and begged him to let the two Jesuit priests go. And it was in fact a Jesuit priest had been tortured and revealed the location of said priests that were later captured by the dictatorship. And during his time as the head of the Jesuit priesthood, Francis devoted a lot of church time to sheltering enemies, so called enemies of the state, trade unionists, socialists, in Jesuit priesthood churches. So I think it shows sort of the scale he'll go to for the common good, really.
Yes, definitely.
Hmm. But
Obviously we'll keep the podcast up to date in the next episode if we hear anything before then. And I will put my opinions on the table when they elect a new pope, and I'll say what I think of it. But
very much.
it really is important to think that they also haven't. There's also a pope from America, Robert Prevost, who is one of the favourites, and it could be the first American pope we've had.
Hmm.
Obviously, I think there was a bit of talk when the Pope first died last Monday that Kevin Farrell, who is now the person, remind me of the name, Lee, sorry. It's the person that takes over after the Pope dies. Is it the not the
His
Conclave,
death.
it's the, Carmelo Lange, whatever it is, something like that.
Hmm.
He was one of the favourites to take it, and I think he actually said at some point he wasn't going to take it. But there was a time a few years ago when someone obviously was elected pope, but they actually said they weren't going to be the pope. I don't know who it was. I can't remember.
I'm trying to remember.
I say Carmelenjo. I want to say it's Pope John Paul the Third. It wasn't the first. It was something like that. No, it wasn't the Pope John. It was anyone, but it was someone of that decided they weren't going to become pope for specific reasons.
Hmm. Trying to. I'm not quite remember. I know what you're talking about. I can't quite remember the Pope's name. I should try to find it out after this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the safest bet to make would be that the next Pope will probably either be someone in the moderate or progressive wing of the church, as there is not a real appetite, seems, among a lot of cardinals to return to the more conservative viewpoint of Catholicism.
I reckon it'd be someone that's quite high up in the sort of the Catholic Church in the Vatican. So currently, like the Secretary of State for the Vatican. I feel like it'd be someone of that sort of someone that knows the Vatican well and knows how to bring the people together.
Almost definitely, but we shall keep a close eye on that and see any of the developments. But now, for the next issue, we have the first Battle of the Ballots, in which the first election we shall cover for this is the Australian election, which will be taking place in, I believe, less than a week as of right now, maybe just over a week. The top contenders for this, of course, are the Australian Labor Party, led by ardent left winger Anthony Albanese, or the Liberal National Coalition, led by Peter Dutton. Thomas, I know you've been following this election very closely. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Oh, I've got more than just a few thoughts on it. It's it's really a moment that will uh, define how Anthony Dutton uh, turns the Liberal Party, around from Scott Morrison's time in office as the Prime Minister, because obviously the Liberals have since been battling and wrestling with themselves about their identity since they lost the last election.
They've had a bit of
Mm.
an identity
But
crisis.
it's also a crunch point as well. But it's also a crunch point as well for uh, Anthony Albanese because he uh, quite critically lost his referendum uh, on the rights of Aboriginals for representation, better representation in Parliament, and it it really is a major moment for both parties. Whether it proves that Anthony Dutton, firstly, has been able to turn the Liberal Party around from Scott Morrison's leadership, which was uh, incredibly business focused and uh, was quite unpopular by the point they left office, as proven by the election. And also for Anthony Albanese to really distance himself from the mistakes that he has made, such as the referendum, which obviously did not go the way he wanted. Quite an area that has really flared up tensions actually has been on climate policy. Most critically, nuclear energy has been, in fact, a major hitting point for the Labour Party throwing its punches at the Liberals because there has been a split in the national Liberal coalition. You've got uh, Dutton, who is very much in favour now of moving towards beginning the construction of a nuclear energy infrastructure project in Australia, which would be one of a kind. Uh, and you've got the Nationals who are far more sceptical of that kind of proposal because of firstly its costs, and secondly because they are quite distrustful of climate policy in general, and they believe that it is an incorrect direction to go in, since
Can I just jump in there?
they believe it's unnecessary.
I would say generally, Thomas, like globally, governments don't actually care that much about climate policy at all. I would say
No, they do very much.
I disagree.
Definitely in Australia,
Yeah,
it's been a major debate for the last 20 years. You've had the Liberal government when they were last in power, were essentially almost every day in a constant battle over climate policy. It was always at the forefront of the debate, perhaps in other countries where it is not discussed very much because of the type of industry. In the UK, we don't have a fossil fuel industry anymore. In Australia, though, almost the bedrock of the industrial foundations of Australia. It has one of the largest coal mining industries in the world. It's the largest provider for a lot of those minerals as well for most nations to be powered by. It's always probably going to be at the forefront of debate as long as coal mining in Australia remains one of the largest industries. Scott Morrison is very famous and also infamous for his uh, skit in Parliament where he held up a lump of coal and brandished it at the opposition, saying that they're afraid of coal because they think it hurts the world. But now we can see that uh, there has clearly been a shift in policy within the Liberal Party. They're attempting to at least try and touch out with the climate policy issue, but uh, Labour, and particularly Anthony Albanese, is not having any of it. He's been quite clear saying that it's an expensive policy, that building nuclear infrastructure in a country such as Australia, which has no existing infrastructure, would be incredibly expensive, and he's been focusing more on issues such as housing, and the cost and the threat of Medicare being cut by the Liberals. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Liberals uh, sort of distance themselves from Scott Morrison, uh, and whether they have done a successful job at that for the last 4 years now, and also for how Anthony Albanese changes his party and tries to sort of redirect their focus after suffering some challenges over the last couple of years, particularly in things such as the One Nation referendum.
An issue with the Liberals seems to be tad history lesson, but the predecessor to the Liberals was the United Australia Party, not the Clive Palmer one. He nicked that name. But the problem with the UAP was that it flew so close to the business community that it effectively became the political arm of what was called National Union, which was a tight knit group of business owners. And in fact, the founder of the Liberal Party, Robert Menzies, who all of the Liberals tend to look up to as the almost Churchill like figure of the party, Menzies himself was incredibly distrustful of a lot of business people. He said that they didn't understand politics, they didn't understand how things worked, and that you shouldn't trust them. And it seems as though the Liberals have completely forgotten these views of Menzies, and it's Peter Dutton, the leader of the Liberal Party, very much does seem to be in the pocket of people like Gina Rinehart, the big coal magnates in Australia, which has caused a lot of issues around propriety and whether or not he can be a fully balanced prime minister if he's in the pocket of a multi-billionaire.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's definitely a bit of a tough moment for the Liberals when they're still struggling to break away from the image of simply being the party that has always stood with, well, less stood with, more in the pocket of large corporations in Australia. It is not really breaking that image, I would say. Um, Dustin has more or less just reinforced it. But what has been noticeable is the is the more cautious approach Dutton has taken in terms of the scandals. Uh, he has been he was obviously quite apologetic when the many scandals that had plagued Scott Morrison's premiership were brought up, but at the same time, he has now done to his best efforts to brush them under the rug. And the question is really, will the Australian people completely forget what happened the last time the Liberals were in power, where it was a government plagued with scandals and many issues? Whether that is simply just a reflection of the personality of Scott Morrison, who was an eccentric man who had very questionable morals, or is it something more deep rooted in the Liberal Party that Dutton has not been able to get rid of and is simply trying to disguise it from the view of the public?
Additionally, with the Liberals obviously can't hold government on their own. They're in what's called coalition with the National Party, which are essentially the party of sort of rural Australia, whereas the Liberals are more for the inner cities. The National Party have not been having a good time of late. I know they've gone down to some very disastrous defeats in places like Western Australia. They're doing quite well up in Queensland, the LNP. However, whether or not that will translate to the national election is somewhat uncertain as of late. In terms of other parties as well, you've got the Greens, which, as we spoke about earlier, they're far more popular than the Canadian Greens in Canada or the British Greens in Great Britain. They hold a significant portion of seats in the Senate. I believe it is around 10, maybe 11 that they hold. They sort of hold the position of the party left of the main one, whilst also being a big environmentalist green politics party. And it looks like they're going to do somewhat okay in this election. Whether they'll get more seats, currently unknown. But of course, other than that, you've got the very interesting parties, the ones that always get a bit of attention. You've got Pauline Hanson's One Nation, who is seen very much as the Australian Nigel Farage. And then, of course, you have the great Clive Palmer and his new Trumpet of Patriots Party. Thomas, I know you've got some fairly strong opinions on those two individuals, do you not?
Yes, I think it's a ridiculous attempt of simply mimicking the political movement in other countries such as the UK and America, simply trying to ride the wave of populism. However, I could say quite confidently, compared to other nations as well, with populism, this attempt is flawed from the very beginning. I would be entirely surprised and probably quite horrified, to be honest, if the Australian population actually put quite a significant amount of trust in them. They haven't really proposed any policies that I could call realistic. And it seems to be more of a personality cult rather than anything else. An attempt of a politician who has fallen out of favor with the mainstream, trying to claw his way back. Uh, but I would say it is likely to be in vain. I would hope the Australian people can see through this little display of populism and clearly reject him from this.
I think one of the biggest issues, one of the most biggest sort of issues with for the incoming government in Australia is the healthcare situation in Australia right now. I was reading the other day that apparently the whole healthcare of Australia is on the downfall and it's almost at its knees. There was a graph I saw where it was something like the majority of Australia has less than 10% of GP clinics that are free, unless you're going like Adelaide or like Brisbane and Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne. But there's quite a lot. But there is literally hardly anywhere that you can get free healthcare, and or even just healthcare in general. And I feel like for whoever comes in and takes over as the next government, need to really look at that, and that should be their top of their priorities.
But yes,
Christopher?
Anthony has been quite heavily pushing the policy of increasing the number of free walk-in clinics around rural Australia. Uh, he has been boasting about how he successfully managed to open a record about 200, I believe, was some of the figures he was saying. So he is trying to set out a platform that he is sort of the man to stand up for rural healthcare. But of course, we'll have to see whether he can prove that to the electorate.
Yeah.
Of course, the big worry in this is that if Dutton gets in, much as his colleague Campbell did in Queensland when he was Premier, that he'll most likely slash healthcare, or Medicare as it's known in Australia, down to the bone, as previous governments of the Liberals have historically done to a lot of more welfare focused policies introduced by Labour governments.
Yes, definitely. And I also feel like just in general, there's a lot of issues for in Australia at the minute, and also worldwide. But looking more at Australia, they've got cost of living and how that is just astronomically in Australia, and also there's another thing I've read about house prices. Apparently, that's like Australia at the minute is like one of the most expensive countries to live in.
I think a lot of that is humongous houses in places like Sydney. I'm not too sure the exact name of the neighbourhood. There's a particular neighbourhood in Sydney where it's sort of ridiculously high prices for housing.
Yes.
So there are a lot of issues around that.
Oh yes, as a former as a former resident of Sydney, I can also say from experience that the housing situation is it is ridiculous. It's gotten so bad that uh people are now building floors on their houses to house family members in them because they cannot afford to get their own house. So they are literally increasing the size of their own home to accommodate other family members, which just shows you just the situation is probably now at the most critical point it has been since the mortgage crash in the 2008 financial crash. So we're looking at a definite housing crisis emerging in uh, New South Wales, mainly where the prices tend to be the highest, but also in Victoria as well, where Melbourne is also showing quite expensive property prices.
And unusually, like the rest of the world, it's something I've just realised. The last election in Australia was held on a Saturday, and this one is as well. It's held on my birthday. So coming up on Saturday, they're going to be going to the polls, which I think just really sort of means that I think it's a good idea to have it on a weekend, really, because it means that everyone can vote. They don't have to worry about people working, like teachers, etc. Don't need to really worry about getting time off work to vote or fitting in work around their time to vote. So yeah.
I think a big factor in this election is that both of the leaders of the major parties are from the more ideologically radical groups. Anthony Albanese, famously from Labour left, a big fan of people like Gough Whitlam and people of that nature. Peter Dutton, famously from the Liberal sort of hard right, from the LNP in Queensland, that are notorious for being very right wing, which was never really the plan. Dutton had always really been used as a foot soldier to scare a lot of the. He'd been used as a scare tactic by Morrison to get himself into the leadership. The general belief is that if Morrison lost the 22 election, that Josh Frydenberg would move in, be the natural leader post Morrison. Of course, he lost his seat to a Teal independent, which meant that, which is similar fate that before a lot of moderates in the Liberal Party, which meant that the only people who were left were people like Dutton on the more radical wing of the Liberal Party,
Yeah.
which, which caused a lot of issues. Primarily in sort of the, I think at first Dutton did try to pivot towards the more, did try to pivot back to these seats and say that he was promoting women and he was a progressive. But when that failed to work in successive by-elections, he pivoted back to his natural Tony Abbott-esque home ground of ideologically right-wing, attack on everything, and eventually something will pop up and work. At first in the polling, it did seem as though this election would be safe, liberal, they were going to win. But recent polling that's come out in the past few days suggests that Labour may clinch this election just barely.
Yeah, it does look very close at the moment in the polls, isn't it? Isn't the polls changed again since like the other day. They're changing like daily, but
Yes, quite a close knit election.
unlike that,
Although,
unlike that of Canada, really, at the minute.
although in the two-party preferred, the two parties are what looks to be about 10 points in between them. So it seems a lot bigger there, but with the primary vote, that's where it gets. So, because Australia have a very different election system to us, they're done on preferences. So you'll
Do they have?
put your choice.
Is that where you'd have to number the candidates? So it's like fucking have to number them 1 to 5, like they do in.
Yes, and
What's transferable vote? Whatever it's called.
yes, and they cut candidates out each time, and eventually it goes to next candidate until someone gets elected.
I think that's quite a
So,
good way of doing it, to be honest.
it is a somewhat popular way of doing it because it means that,
Although I don't think it would work in this country.
I mean, it could do. Some people are very much in favour of it being taken to the UK.
I just don't think it would. I don't think it would work for the simple reason that you can't expect 650 constituencies to be able to come out multiple times to vote in whoever their favoured candidate is.
I think the way you do it
Take
is
too long.
there are about 150 electorates in Australia. I think what you do is you just number each candidate. So I think it wouldn't be that difficult a process to. It would make counting ballots in election day an absolute nightmare.
Yes,
But I
definitely.
think it's somewhat achievable.
Yes.
So, do we have any thoughts on who we think will win, gentlemen?
Julia Gillard.
Yeah, I have to go with
Sorry,
that.
wrong election.
Yeah.
I don't. To be honest, I don't actually really know. I think it's too close to call. I'm gonna play devil's advocate and sit on the fence and say I'm gonna wait and see.
Hmm.
I just feel like whatever happens, there's just many issues for them to go and fix.
Hmm.
And yeah,
I think what most likely seen might happen is we'll have a Pauline Hanson led administration in which she'll get all those policies done that she talked for years about, or I joke, but I think most likely it'll just be another Labour government. Personally, it does seem as though that's the most likely thing because there's been a lot of good done by the Australian Labour Party recently,
yeah,
so that seems to be the process still going. But
yes.
there's any other thoughts, chaps, on this election before we end?
Not really. No, I'm just quite excited. I've got an election on my
Not
birthday for
really.
once. I feel like
Well,
I
that
never, I
is
never get an election on my birthday, so I've got something to look forward to and watch.
excellent.
But
And
anyway, I can end it. So thank you for listening. Obviously, if you have any views, please do not hesitate to get in the comments and tell us your opinions on what we've spoken about today. And we will see you all in the next one. See you later, gents.
goodbye.